Welcome and thank you for joining us. My name is Carmiel Arbit. I'm a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, helping to lead the Council's growing work on Israel. I'm delighted to host today's event on the one-year anniversary of the signing of the Abraham Accords between Israel and its regional partners. Throughout the course of two discussions today, we will look at the trajectory of Israel's normalized and normalizing relations over the last year. We'll look at the accomplishments, surprises, even the disappointments, as well as the future challenges and priorities for regional partnerships moving forward. Today's event features a fantastic lineup. We'll start with a panel discussion with my friends and colleagues from the Atlantic Council, from Israel's Institute for National Security Studies, and the UAE's Emirates Policy Center, the product of a partnership between the three institutions launched last October to explore the opportunities presented by the Accords across sectors. This work builds on the Council's expanding work on Israel, including our forthcoming multilateral conference on normalization, generously supported by the Jeffrey M. Talpins Foundation. After the first panel, we'll transition into a conversation with the UAE's Minister of Economy, His Excellency Abdullah bin Tuq Al-Mari. As a reminder, this event is on the record and will be recorded. Please leave your questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen, and do tell me who you are, and we'll do our best to get through all of them. And so with that, allow me to briefly introduce our speakers. Will Wexler is the director of the Rafiq Hariri Center and Middle East Programs of the Atlantic Council. His most recent government position was Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Combating Terrorism. Previously, he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Counter-Narcotics and Global Threats. During the Clinton administration, Will served as a special advisor to the Secretary of the Treasury. He had previously served as Director for Transnational Threats on the National Security Council staff, and prior to that was a special assistant to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He is currently also president of the Center on Illicit Networks and Transnational Organized Crime and the treasurer of the American Historical Association. He was previously a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute and a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. He has also had a separate career in finance. He was vice chairman of Capital Peak Asset Management and managing director of Greenwich Associates. He's a graduate of Cornell University, received his master's from Columbia's School of International and Public Affairs. Thank you, Will, for being here. Also joining us is Dr. Ebtissam Al-Ketbi, the president of Emirates Policy Center. She is also its founder. It is one of the most important think tanks in the Arab world. Dr. Al-Ketbi is a professor of political science at the United Arab Emirates University. In recognition of her role and the great respect she enjoys as part of a distinguished elite in the UAE, she was appointed in 2015 as a member of the Consultative Commission of the GCC. In 2018, she was also listed as one of the 50 most influential women in the Arab world. In 2019, she received the Women's Super Achiever Award during the World Women Leadership Congress. In 2021, she was chosen as an advisor in the Global Commission for Post-Pandemic Policy. Thank you so much for being here. And lastly, joining us is Udi Deckel, the Managing Director of the Institute for Security Studies, or INSS. He joined in 2012, having served as head of the negotiations team with the Palestinians in the Annapolis process under the Olmert government. In February of 2013, he was appointed managing director. He had previously served as he's a retired brigadier general, during which time he filled many senior IDF roles, including in intelligence, international military cooperation, and strategic planning. His last post in the IDF was head of the Strategic Planning Division in the Planning Directorate of the General Staff. He is a reservist and head of the Center for Strategic Planning. Previously, he served as the head of the Foreign Relations Division in the General Staff and as head of the Israel-UN-Lebanon Committee following the Second Lebanon War and head of military committees with Egypt and Jordan. In addition, he headed a working group on strategic operative cooperation with the United States. He served on the 2006 Commission to update Israel's security concept and coordinated the formulation of IDF strategy. Thank you, Udi, for being here. So I don't want to waste too much time. I'd really like to go straight into questions. As we look back on the Accords over the past year, what do the three of you think have been the biggest accomplishments so far? Have there been any surprises? Will, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Let me give you a little bit of my sense. I mean, the Abraham Accords represent rare good news from the region, and there's a potential for greater positive impact down the road. It's really a strategic inflection point in many respects. You know, there was not a lot, in my view, to praise when considering the Trump administration's foreign policies, and there was a great deal to criticize. But in my view, any objective analyst with a clear understanding of U.S. interests in the region has to conclude that this dynamic is indisputably positive. So let me just talk for a little bit about why the Abraham Accords took place, a little bit about what the track record of victories and challenges are, and then just a little sense of the way forward, if I might. First, why they took place. There was geopolitical reasons, there were economic reasons, and there were other reasons, as well. Clearly, as we at the Atlantic Council have written about quite extensively, the perception of U.S. withdrawal is the most important factor that's affecting the region right now. Lots of non-our partners have been encroaching on what they see as a vacuum, including, of course, Iran. And this overall dynamic is distinctly negative to U.S. interests, and of course, it's further accelerated by what's happened in Afghanistan. But one of the positive outcomes is this emerging coalition that we're seeing that is defined by the Abraham Accords. One of the open questions now is whether the U.S. will be content to be an observer to this dynamic, further encouraging the perception of U.S. withdrawal, or whether it will be an active participant in driving the dynamic to maximize its benefits over the long run. But really, the economic potential here, as much as the geostrategic, was really driving all of this. This is a fundamental difference between Israel's previous normalizations with Egypt and Jordan, for which Israel was the center of their national security considerations. In contrast, while strategic considerations were essential in this case, they're not the only driving factor. The country, especially in the Gulf, had not been at war. It was Israel's economic prowess of the last couple of decades, economic development in the Gulf and elsewhere. These were a lot of the driving factors. Folks were also interested in changing the overall narrative in the region, looking for a region that was going to be accepting, tolerant, was going to encourage business to business, people to people ties. There was a real objective of taking annexation, Israel's plans for annexation of much of the West Bank off the table. That was a deep hole that Netanyahu and Trump had dug for themselves, that would have had a lasting, sharply negative implications for Israel and the Palestinians both. It keeps the two-state solution viable, albeit on life support. And it prevents the kind of self-defeating action that again would have been really negative for Israel. It also changes the narrative in that Palestinian concerns, no matter how legitimate, are not the only factor, and no longer have veto over other concerns for others. Why should the U.S. care? This advances U.S. interests. It helps isolate Iran, given that Iranian behavior continues to indirectly and directly threaten others and destabilize the region. It helps potential for advancing prosperity and regional security. The U.S. should not only welcome this dynamic, should we actively look for opportunities to help deepen and broaden it amongst normalized state and expand it to others. Now, finally, let me get to the question you specifically asked about victories and challenges so far. The victories are straightforward. First, after the Abraham Accords were announced just almost a year ago, others joined, Morocco and Sudan. We have Israel's developed observer status in the African Union. Economic progress in some areas has been remarkably quick, even despite COVID. It proved resilient given what happened in Gaza and the conflict there. There was no walk back from some of the parties. Nothing was canceled. Some things were only temporarily delayed. And we just seen last week that Morocco's moderate Islamist party, which was the part of Morocco that was most concerned about this, they suffered major losses in the election. So the resilience is there. And it's not personality driven at the end of the day. Netanyahu and Trump both tried to present themselves during their election campaigns as saying that they were personally essential to the dynamics. They both have lost, and there's been no backtracking. So what are the challenges? The challenges are that the economic connections to date is still early, but they've been unevenly dispersed, concentrated on the UAE at the outset. The material benefits have not yet been evident to most of the people in the countries. Sudan has not yet signed a formal agreement, although we have lots of hopes for progress in the near term. Also, the pace of country accession has stalled. One hears stories about Indonesia and Mauritania, dreams of Saudi Arabia. Oman fairly quickly in their foreign ministers shot down reports that it would be the third Gulf state to join the Accords, although it's positive about the process. Understandably, and in my view correctly, the Biden administration doesn't share the Trump administration's inclination to quickly toss away longstanding U.S. policies for the sake of normalization. And so that might be part of it. Another challenge is the Palestinians, who have been unnecessarily rejectionist towards the Accords. I understand why, but it frankly doesn't serve the Palestinian people and doesn't take advantage of potential opportunities that they might have over the longer term under the Accords. And the last thing I really want to talk about is the U.S. context. I know my colleagues will talk a lot about views from Israel and from the Emirates, but as compared to in Israel, where the new government, Prime Minister Bennett, Foreign Minister Lapid, have picked up the baton and are making this dynamic their own, with Foreign Minister Lapid especially driving the deepening and broadening of the Abraham Accords. We haven't seen that so far in the United States. It must be said, though, that during the campaign, when this was announced in the home stretch, less than 2 months before the election, this was impressively depoliticized by Biden and his team, for which they deserve a lot of credit. They saw then, and they see now, and I've talked to many of them, that there's uniform support for this trend of normalization. They appreciate the value. And so they try to depoliticize it. But unfortunately, more recently, there's been increasing signs of politicization in the United States, even after the departure of Netanyahu, who himself drove the politicization of the U.S.-Israel relationship in unuseful directions. Biden administration has been relatively slow to mobilize greater diplomatic and economic engagement to build on the momentum of new partnerships, I think it has to say. It's not named a special envoy for Middle East normalization, even as special envoys have been named in a number of different areas. It shies away from using the name Abraham Accords, which appears silly at best to those who are parties to the agreements, and it suggests that domestic political concerns are dominant. At worst, it risks signaling a lack of interest, which all of this is a missed opportunity. Now, it's still very early in the Biden administration, and there's ample time to shift the emphasis on diplomacy. This perception of reluctance is reinforced by a small but vocal minority amongst Democrats on the Hill who have come out against the normalizations, seemingly led by Representative Ilhan Omar, who wrote an essay to that effect in The Nation last November. Again, this is completely outweighed, in fact, by a great number of statements by a large number of other Democrats in the Senate and the House. But it risks continuing the erroneous perception that this issue cuts along partisan lines. This is something that the Biden administration should actively contest. And the last thing I just want to mention is there's also some blame for the people in the Trump camp who seek to politicize the Abraham Accords domestically for their own personal advantage. As Trump looks to run again against Biden, and Jared Kushner is looking to raise his own investment fund that will be focused on the subject. Traditionally in the US, former presidents have understood that the highest form of policy success is getting your successor to adopt your policies. So for instance, George H.W. Bush did everything he could to encourage Bill Clinton to push his NAFTA agreement through Congress. And the issue became a bipartisan one when it passed with support from both sides of the aisle. What Bush didn't do is have one of his sons create a NAFTA Institute, as Jared Kushner has created the Abraham Accords Institute. You know, in this era of increasing politicization in the US on every issue, there was hope at the beginning during the election that this issue would not be caught up in that. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be the case. Now, these problems are all solvable. The challenge can be overcome and the positive dynamics reinforced. Overall, this is a very, very positive story, and I'm really happy to be here with my colleagues to talk about it. So with that, let me hand it back to you, Carmiel.
Thanks so much, Will. That was really comprehensive. Abdeslam, I'd like to turn to you to unpack a bit about some of the issues that Will touched on, but specifically to look at the impact that the Accords have had on the UAE and the region, looking, as Will did, at both the opportunities, but also some of the challenges ahead.
Well, first, thank you for the invitation. I think it's hard to speak after Will. He covered everything. He didn't leave anything for me and for Odi. But I'll try my best.
Let's see.
Well, in the list of fundamental shifts in Middle East, the Abraham Accords of 2020 would be the most prominent and vital. This is about the process of normalizing relations between Israel and four Arab countries in less than 3 months after more than 25 years of stalemate and peace process. The shifts began with the UAE and Israel announcing a peace treaty in August 2020, starting a domino effect on the Arab and Muslim countries. 1 year on, we can say that the Abraham Accord were a game changer, and they have started to contribute to reshaping some features of Middle East and the region. Despite challenges, and yes, everything has challenges, these accords remain capable of providing transformational momentum. These accords, which were signed in White House on September 15, 2020, represent a fundamental change in the approach to Middle East conflict. Although the treaty never claimed to resolve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, it was described as historical moment or historical breakthrough, and it really is. It is the first peace treaty between the Arab country and Israel in more than 25 years. It is also one of the most evident practical manifestations of the new thinking espoused by the Emirati leadership to tackle regional problems and challenges to enhance moderation, coexistence, and prosperity. Now, the UAE-Israel peace treaty gave an impetus to the peace process and negotiation between the Palestinian and Israeli. It was linked to the freezing or suspicion of the Netanyahu's government plan to annex 30% of the West Bank and Jordan Valley to Israel. It is important for everybody not to miss this opportunity. Refrain from taking unilateral measures, stick to the two-state solution, and help build trust between the Palestinians and the Israelis in support of peace negotiations between the two sides. In all cases, it is still early to assess the impact of concluding the Abraham Accords as a strategic opportunity to build bridges and promote values of peace, stability, dialogue, cooperation, tolerance, prosperity, and justice instead of conflicts, militarization, and extremism. Now, for whatever reason or motivation, any parties, either Trump or Netanyahu's, went after that accords, or even whoever other Arab countries, for whatever reason, I think it is a successful process, and we should all, not only the Americans, not only the Israelis, not only the Emirates or those Arab who signed, I think for the whole world, if we are looking for stabilization and stability in the region and security, we should all, and the new administration, Biden administration, should promote that accords. I will stop. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And Udi, I'd like to turn to you to kind of pick up where Ebtisam left off, and specifically look not only in reflecting, but also looking at what gaps remain. Do you see greater space for cross-sector cooperation between normalized countries that hasn't yet been actualized?
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation. And as Madam Ebtisam said, Willie and Ebtisam already said everything for the beginning. But I would like to put the focus upon something which is very important. The first time, Abraham Accords is the first time that the region opened the door to Israel officially to be part of the region. Until that time, for Israel, the region was basically a threat, and we had to protect ourselves from any kind of risk or threats which can come from the region. And now we are looking about what are the options and opportunities that we can develop together. So this is, it's difficult even to explain the major change in the Israel strategic position in the Middle East, because it's also create a wide range of countries that cooperate for stability in the Middle East, trying to block, I assume that we will speak about Iran later on, but trying to block Iranians' negative influence in the region, and creating common goals, that things that we can develop together. So this is a great achievement for Israel in that case. And I would like to say that everybody tried to say that this is only connected to the Iranian threat. This is not the picture. The idea that Israel can be part of the Middle East, cooperate with other countries, develop things with other countries, and exchanging, ideas, tourism, and other activity. So this is a major change in the situation. But I would like to say something, because Will said about it, but this is a key issue, because the driving force or the drive force in some cases lost the momentum, because it was the United States under Trump administration which pushed all the parties to go forward in the Abraham Accords. And now Biden administration which support the Abraham Accords. Basically, they are not support, I assume, any other policy of Trump administration, but they support the Abraham Accords, but there is no the same driving force in order to push the parties and others to participate and to be part of it, because in that case we can create something bigger with a lot of positive influence to the region. There were some, let's say, along the last year, we have some problems, especially in Israel, like Operation Guardian of the Walls, especially with the Hamas in last May. But one of the important things, as Willie said, that one of the ideas of those spoilers is to break any positive process between Israel and the Arab countries. This is one of the objectives. It wasn't the main objective, but this is one of the objectives that they try to develop. And in that case, as we see that the relations and the cooperation between Israel and the other countries didn't suffer and still go on, which is very, very important for the future. About the challenges, as I said before, one of the main challenges is how to convince the Biden administration to be more involved, okay, in that process, because the Biden administration endorsement of the normalization between Israel and Arab countries, as I said before, despite of its all overall rejection of Trump policy, but it has no trying to give energy to that process. You know, unfortunately, it's very important offering rewards for other countries to participate in that positive game, okay? And this is a issue, a challenge that I hope that we will see change in the policy and more activity of Biden policy and activity in the Middle East, because we are the coalition supporting the US policy, okay, and can implement the US policy in the region, especially the stability and blocking the bad guys together. So I hope that this is something that we will see in the next years about that. As I said before, we have to discuss in our meeting, and I'm open it, but I assume that you will ask us about what can be the consequences of return with Iran to the JCPOA to the region and to Abraham Accord. So I'm not going to say a word about it now, but I assume that we have to discuss it. About the Palestinian issue, and this is very interesting because we have a project together, the EPC, AC, and INSS, and one of the main idea was to try to bring Palestinians to be part of it, in order to see that there is also benefits for the Palestinians from Abraham Accords, that they can be part of you know, the process and benefits in economy, technology, water technology, and green energy, and a lot of things which on the table discussions between especially Israel and the UAE, but also the others. But they don't want to be part of it at all. Okay, for them, Abraham Accords, it's like betrayal of the Palestinian cause and unacceptable, and they see it as a part of a Trump peace deal, which was a betrayal for them, of course. Nobody asked them about that. So they don't want to be part of it. Even they can achieve a lot of things, you know, by doing regional cooperation with Israel and other countries. And the last things that I would like to mention now, for the beginning, you know, Israel has a peace agreement with Egypt and Jordan. And today our Prime Minister is going to meet President Assisi in Sharm el-Sheikh, which is one of the, I think that this is one of the positive outcome from Abraham Accords, thinking about border cooperation in the region. But there is one issue which I would like to see, and I hope there is a signal, especially because of the policy of UAE, because the public was not part of the peace agreement between Israel and Egypt and Israel and Jordan. It was strategic partnership, especially security, but no real people-to-people activity. And now we can see that there is very positive outcome by people which meet each other, do things together, visiting each other. So maybe it will bring the peace also between the people and not only between the leaders. Thank you.
Thank you. A lot to unpack there, and I know we already have lots of questions rolling in from the audience, including a number of questions that focus on the Palestinians, but I'm going to pause on the Palestinian question and compile them and go back to something else that Udi, you touched on and really teed up, which is the question of the Iranians and how Iranian behavior affects relations between Israel and the UAE, and also to look at the impact of JCPOA negotiations. What would a successful reentry into the JCPOA mean for the Abraham Accords? And frankly, what would its failure mean? Will, why don't we go back to you?
To me?
To Will. Why don't we go back to Will, and then others can respond to Will as you wish.
Sure. I think, the countries that were involved in the JCPOA, particularly Israel and the UAE, Bahrain, when the JCPOA was initially negotiated, they expressed their disapproval of that approach. The previous Israeli government under Netanyahu was exceedingly vocal about that and decided to use it in the context of U.S. domestic politics in a way that was unfortunate for those who care about the U.S.-Israel relationship. I think what you've seen is twofold. Is one, a very different approach this time around from the countries in question towards the United States, particularly towards the Biden administration. A very different approach in the Biden administration in terms of welcoming the quiet discussions that they have with these parties. But you've also seen challenges for those who thought it was going to be especially easy for the Biden administration to rejoin the JCPOA. They, I think, have now crashed on the shoals of reality, as they say, and realize how difficult this is going to be, even before the recent Iranian elections, which brought in, as designed, a whole new cadre of hardliners. So with the JCPOA not looking as positive, the likelihood to get back into it looking as positive as it perhaps some people thought previously, the question immediately comes to Plan B. What happens if they don't have that kind of nuclear agreement? And here, what I'm hearing and what I'm seeing is a great willingness and openness to amongst the folks in the Biden administration to talk with their regional partners about those kinds of scenarios and those kinds of availabilities, which is all a very good thing. At the same time, as I said at the very outset, and as Udi and Ebtisam said absolutely correctly, while the Abraham Accords has the potential to be about so much more than security issues, it's security issues that played a significant role and in driving it in the first place. And those security issues have a lot to do with Iran. Iran's behavior hasn't changed. And so as long as Iran continues that behavior, it will reinforce the need for the countries to come together. Iran at the same time, as Udi said, along with its proxies, will desperately try to be spoilers in that, will try to raise the kinds of issues that they see as possible driving countries apart. But those kinds of initiatives have to be confronted and rejected. Back to you, Carmiel.
Great. I want to transition into the Palestinians because, as I said, I've seen a number of questions coming through from the audience. And so I'll try to synthesize this, but Ebtisam, I think I have one here that's directed to you specifically. So broadly, how has normalization affected the Palestinians over the past year? There was much talk of bringing them into this process, of projects that the UAE intended to work with the Palestinians on. Can you update us a little bit on that? And then I'll ask a question sort of more specifically, which comes, and I'm going to summarize it a bit because it's long, but from Zaha Hassan at Carnegie, that's looking at the activities of what she perceives to be activities between the UAE and Israeli settlements, including trade agreements that have affected those settlement companies operating in the territories. How does this create an impetus to the peace process, she asks? and expresses her concern that it undermines the possibility of a two-state solution. Abtisam, why don't you start, and then maybe we'll go to Udi to react as well.
Well, the 11-day conflict in Gaza in May 2021 between Israel and Hamas came to an end after Egypt broke a ceasefire. The conflict was one of the biggest tests for the Abraham Accord. The fourth Gaza war erupted in the wake of the event in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in Jerusalem, and clashes with Israeli police and extremists, and we all know the story now. Despite all the damage and the media campaign against Arab countries that signed the Abraham Accords, the Accords have endured and showed that the decision to forget them was a robust strategic one. Now, I would say here that Sheikh Abdullah bin Zayed, UAE Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, said in an interview with the Israel-UAE-Ara news site in the late June 2021, that he said, I believe that sooner or later, Israel should resolve the Palestinian problem. This is not only harms Israel's image, but it's also liable to raise doubts as to its future. And this is a big challenge for you, Israeli. Now, from UAE perspective, the challenge now is to involve the Palestinian National Authority and Palestinians in the new peace process. It is safe to argue that in a region with many conflicts that often seems totally interactable, the Abraham Accords appended what seems to be an interactable situation in favor of coexistence. However, part of the spirit of the Accords is the recognition of that there is still more work to be done. Among them is the recognition that there is still, among them is the continued occupation of Palestinian land by Israel. This is kind of dialogue which emphasizes the dignity and mutual respect on both sides of the Palestinian-Israeli divide is crucial to shaping the lasting legacy of the Abraham Accords. So thus far, 1 year on, the momentum of the Accords built has not eased. So among the challenges that face the Abraham Accords is the intra-Palestinian divisions. Moreover, some political leadership and forces on both sides seeks to manipulate the continued conflict for electoral purposes, as they tend to mobilize support from party constituencies to achieve narrow objectives at the expense of ordinary people future. Additionally, some regional actors are not happy with the Abraham Accords and seeks to undermine this agreement. One of them is, of course, Iran. And in the absence of magical solution, there is no substitute for multilateral diplomacy that can overcome all those obstacles to resolve patience and wisdom. This can create hope for those who believe in peaceful solutions and just settlement by reaping the individual of these peace agreements. Such an approach will weaken the argument of those who adopt the narrative of eternal conflict with the other. And back to Zuha, a question about the the business between the settlers and the businessmen when, let me remind you of something. When Ambassador Al-Ataybi wrote his article in Yadout Ahranot, he was trying to show the Israel the fruits of peace agreement between Israel and the Arabs, and that by also freezing or stopping the annexation, that will encourage the other Arabs to join the Abraham Accord. Now, this doesn't mean, Zuha, that we have to stop every kind of cooperation between the Israelis and the Emiratis because they are settlers. Maybe this will convince. I am on the side of that. You can turn everything negative to positive by more cooperation, by people when they see the fruit of the peace, the fruit of cooperation, they will change their mind. This is, you cannot just sit on the other side and say, I will not do anything. I will not come until you change. That which prevent any solution from 70 years between the Arabs and the Israeli, because the Arabs, they didn't want to take any action until the Israel changed the facts on the ground, which did not happen. So always Israel again, and the Arab are the losers. Okay.
Woody, did you want to respond to that as well?
Yes, of course, we can speak, weeks, months, a year about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and what are the directions for the futures. And I would like to emphasize something that I said before. In the Palestinian camp, all the functions are unwilling to accept any agreement between Israel and other Arab countries before solving the Israeli-Palestinian, if they believe that we are able to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or find any kind of arrangement between us. But in the same time, I don't see any possibility. Even, now our Prime Minister, the President of Egypt, will ask him, what are you going to do in order to promote political process with the Palestinians? So we cannot speak about what we said, permanent status agreement. We cannot agree upon the end state today. And the Palestinian side is not ready to discuss any other concept or paradigm of arrangements with Israel, unless speaking about the end state of permanent status agreement and do it in one action, which we saw after 4 accidents that we are not able to achieve that goal today. But we have to create the conditions for that, because I believe, as many others in Israel still believe, that the 2-state for 2 people, this is the best option for us and the Palestinians. So we have to build up, the conditions, the roads, the tracks that we can go forward in order to achieve it. But we are not able to discuss this today. First of all, in Israel side, because our, I don't know how to call it, the 2-wing government, okay, which cannot agree upon any kind of arrangements between Israel and the Palestinians, which speak about the long run arrangements. We are ready to discuss everything that can promote the daily life condition, everything that can promote the economic situation of the Palestinian Authority, everything that can calm down the situation in Gaza, everything that can support a process of reconstructions of Gaza, everything that the PA can be part of regional activity. So this is things that we can, and we are ready to discuss, but the other side is not ready to discuss with us anything unless we are speaking only about the end state, or the concept which exists is all or nothing. So they prefer the nothing, which is very bad situation for the Palestinians, and not something that can improve dramatically their situation and create hope that we can go forward in order to achieve two-state reality in the future. And I'm not going to promote projects of our institutes, but we put on the table a framework for us and the Palestinians, how to build up those conditions for the future. And unfortunately, I don't see now any ability to promote that because of the Israeli side, but also because of the Palestinian side, because there is no any ability to agree upon the Palestinian side about taking the hard decisions. And of course, they are already in the process or in the dimension of the day after Abbas, and nobody is ready to take any kind of risk now. And so unfortunately, which I don't like it, we have to manage the conflict, but I hope that we will be clever enough in order to find the way to improve the situation and to build up a hope for the future that we can achieve our common goals of two-state reality.
Thank you. I want to shift to another question from the audience. This one comes from Alex Vitenka from the Middle East Institute. He asks, in order to give the Abraham Accords more momentum internationally, how can other world powers such as Russia, China, and the EU play a more proactive and supportive role? Do you see interest to do so by third-party actors so that it's not all on Washington? Will, I'd love for you to kick us off with this question, but I'd like to add to it, which is, should those other actors start to play a greater role, what implications will it have for Washington?
Sure. The reality is that there's no other external power that can replace Washington. Not yesterday, not today, not in the near future, not in the long future if the United States continues to have a constructive role in the region and prevents its withdrawal. But at present, as much as some parties would like to be, there's really no comparison between the role that the United States can play and the role that other external powers can play. Now, that said, so let's look at each one of them in turn. The reality is, my view, is that Russia thrives from chaos in the region. That's where it advances its role. And I don't see it being, I don't see it having had in the past a very constructive role to play in the region. I don't see it today of having a significantly constructive role in the region. It's there. It's important. Lots of countries have to deal with Russia, and that's a reality. But I don't know, all of the regional leaders that I've spoken to, I've not found one that trusts Russia. And that's a real important distinction. As far as China's relatively new in the region. China's tried not to be part of the geopolitics of the region, although that may be changing with some of the recent statements. China, like Russia, has deep relationships with Iran. Even does joint military exercises, just like Russia. So it's unclear, or it's not very likely that they would see this new coalition from a security perspective the same way that the United States would see it. They do, however, unlike Russia, aspire to greater stability and prosperity in the region. The last one is the EU, and the EU, unfortunately, has been more of a bystander on this issue. I think there have been lots of actors in Europe that the Abraham Accords was a direct threat to their long-held narratives about what is most important in the region and what can and what can't be accomplished. I think that there's some shifts in thinking among some European nations towards this. Where Europe could be useful, and by the way, the United States, and despite what Udi is saying about the internal contradictions of the Israeli coalition and the other Arab parties of the Abraham Accords, where they could be useful is presenting a vision for where this could be going. Both Udi and Emtesam mentioned things along these lines, but we're at an early stage right now towards a really binary set of outcomes. On one side, looking 10 to 20 years from now, is an outcome where we look back at the Abraham Accords and we say that it really just followed the same path of Egypt and Jordan, where at the end of the day, it was a continuation of the existing intelligence to intelligence, military to military, contacts on security issues. And that's really all it ended up being at the end of the day. If that's the story at the end, this will have been a large failure, that we will have not accomplished what we need to accomplish. The alternative vision is one where this sets the seed and gets the ball rolling for a completely different kind of Middle East that we've seen, with a coalition that is built together that is looking for a much different way of joint prosperity and joint security, and as was mentioned, the people to people and business to business relations. That's a very different vision. Can countries in Europe and can the European Union contribute to that vision? Absolutely they can. And they should and they must. And so they haven't to date, but in any significant way. But I think that there's a real opportunity for them to do so in conjunction with Washington.
Udi, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I totally agree about that. Everybody speak about the US pull out from the Middle East. The US is not able to pull out from the Middle East, and this is and Europe, as Will said, the EU is now concentrated in the internal problem. Everywhere there is a lot of internal problem, and especially when you speak about the COVID-19, the economic situation, and other things. So I still believe that this is the direction. But I wanted to say something because we didn't mention it very clear, because this is I'm speaking from the Israeli point of view, of course, that one of the major risk or challenge to the agreement can be what will be the outcome of the discussions between the US and Iran about the JCPOA. And because there is two situations. One situation that Iran returned to the JCPOA, which we don't see now that this is the direction of Iran, because they try to achieve a lot of other things before of that. If they're ready for that, I'm not sure about it anymore. And the second situation is that Iran stands at close nuclear threshold situation, which in that both cases, will increase Iranian negative activity in the region, because first of all, they have more budget to spend in order to operate all the proxies due the removal of the sanctions and other things. I don't have to elaborate. And the other things that they will have more confidence, sense of growing power, and under that threat, they could all the time create the risk that they are able to break out to nuclear bomb, and in very short time. And in that case, nobody will take any kind of action against them, because everybody will afraid of to engage with Iran. And that will give Iran energy to operate all the proxies and to challenge us, and especially to challenge UAE and other Gulf countries. And that can be a new situation, not the same environment that we had last year, that we were able to create Abraham Accords. And we have to be ready to discuss it. And it's very important, the discussions between US and its allies in the region about those two possibilities, what can be the outcome and the consequences of those two possibilities, and how to be ready for the future challenges in that case.
Great, thank you. And I want to move to our last question and note we have about 5 minutes left. So what I'll do is I'd like to pose this to all of you, but also to give you an opportunity for closing comments so that we can move into the next section of the program, an interview with the Minister of Economy from the UAE. This question comes from my colleague at the Atlantic Council, Jonathan Furziger, who notes the critical role that Saudi Arabia has played in enabling the Abraham Accords to move forward. Do you see the Saudis as possibly joining the Accords in the near future or playing a more useful role behind the scenes, including by helping prod along the Palestinians? I'll just add to that a little bit of a game we can play, a little gambling. Who do you think will be the next country to normalize in the year ahead? And with that, I'll start with you, Abtesam, and I'll go around the squares.
Sure. Although we are currently in a moment of wait and see, this is definitely possible. The likelihood might be higher if the Accord provide positive models in the region about the benefit of normalization relations between Israel and Arab countries. At the same time, this is related to reducing the American military footprint in the Middle East, as well mentioned, and the challenges and opportunities this creates for Washington in the region. It is also related to ending the stalemate and the peace process and resuming the Palestinian-Israeli talks, de-escalating tension and ending hostilities and unilateral measures. We can speculate that normalization with Israel would be present in any attempts to rearrange regional alignment. In my opinion, such challenge is very much related to the position adopted by President Biden administration, as it has already announced its support for the two-state solution. However, it is unclear how the incumbent US administration can take advantage of this momentum. It remains to be seen how it approaches the two-state solution and makes an attainable goal rather than impossible and late step, as many analysts and so Saudi or others will also ask, okay, if US got rewards with something, or Morocco, what will be their rewards regarding joining this normalization process? And I think this is also in their thinking. Okay,
you want to go next?
Sure. You want me to go next?
Sure. Will, why don't you go next since you have the floor?
Saudi Arabia, it has to be said, could have been a big spoiler for the Abraham Accords and was not. On top of that, it's made actions that have encouraged the Abraham Accords, whether it's allowing overflights or, it's hard to imagine Bahrain going into this so quickly without against the will of Saudi Arabia. There have been positive statements by some of the leaders, in Saudi Arabia. That said, it's not likely to happen in the near term because of a lot of internal Saudi issues. I think there are other countries. At the end of the day, Saudi participation and normalization with Israel would be the most significant thing that could happen to Israel through this process, but it's likely a little farther away. I would imagine some of the other countries that I mentioned previously being earlier in the queue. Judy?
If I can say, I agree with both of you. Saudi Arabia is one of the important countries in the context of expanding the agreement. There is not official relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel, but official relations are important because in that case, other Muslim countries will get, I don't know how to say it, to get the stamp of approval for relations with Israel. And it thereby may be making it easier for Arab and Muslim countries to join the process. The problem, as you mentioned, but there is another issue. Reluctantly, the Saudi royal house, that there is, I don't know if the word is fear, but that such move can harm his status in the Arab Muslim world. They are not confident that this is the time to do that. And also, of course, they have their obligations to the Arab Peace Initiative, which somebody have to see how to develop those relations under the umbrella of the Arab Peace Initiative. So in that case, for them today, it's enough the benefits that they have from the informal relations with Israel. But I think that we have to think together, even not to be part of the Abraham Accords or not, to initiate official relations and ambassadors and things like that. We need Saudi Arabia in order to create a wide range of countries that cooperate for regional stability, okay, that trying to block the negative activity of Iran and try to develop better future to the region.
Great, thank you so much. I know I personally am keeping my eye out for other countries in the region, particularly in Africa, to see where things head in the year to come. I want to thank the three of you for joining us today. We greatly appreciate your insights and our continued partnership between our three institutions. I look forward to continuing this discussion and to seeing what comes in the year ahead for normalization and for the future of the region. With that, I bid you well, and we're going to transition into the second portion of today's event, an interview with His Excellency Abdullah bin Tuq Al Mari, who I believe is at the ready to join us. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me again after 1 year. I'm really looking forward to ask and tell you about the news and great stories that we had for the past year.
Excellent. I'm very much looking forward to this discussion. Your Excellency, why don't I start by introducing you to our audiences. His Excellency Abdullah bin Tuq Al Mari was appointed the Minister of Economy of the UAE in July of 2020. Prior to his appointment, he held senior positions across the government, including as Secretary General of the UAE Cabinet, where he served since 2017, during which he played a central role in strengthening local and federal government independence. He was also the former Director General of the Executive Office of His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum. He has a bachelor's degree in civil engineering from the University of Sheffield. My husband is also an alum of Sheffield, and a graduate of the UAE Government Leaders Program and Mohammed bin Rashid Center for Leadership Development. Thank you again so much for being with us. As you mentioned, you had an interview just a year ago with my colleagues, and during that time you looked optimistically to the future opportunities that the Abraham Accords could afford to the region. I'm interested to hear what tangible progress has been made since then. What have you seen as the biggest economic benefits to have come out of the Accords? Were there any surprises, disappointments? Please, the floor is yours.
First of all, thank you very much for having me. I really look optimistically to talk about today of the achievements. Maybe last year when we spoke, we were very foresighted that we were looking at the future building scenarios. But I think after a year of the Abrahamic Accord, we have a story to say. And the major stories is we exchanged ambassadors. We have signed over 60 MOUs. We have $600 to $700 million of bilateral trade happening. We have funds of billions of dollars that has been announced jointly between the two countries. We are moving into so many areas of economic opportunities, and I think it's very important to look at. We're looking at to create over $1 trillion of economic activity over the next decade. This is kind of the idea of the investments that's happening. We know that the Abu Dhabi Mubadala have just closed a $1 billion investment in Israel, Tamar gas field, Masdar in Israel, EDF as well, renewables announced an agreement to explore renewable energy opportunities in Israel. As well, we have the UAE signed an agreement on food and agri-tech technologies in that area. G42 and Rafael Advanced Defense System as well, looking into more opportunities in signing as well agreements. So yeah, we have a lot to say and a lot to do. And I think the major ones are what just I mentioned. And I think we are really forecasting a lot of MOUs coming in health, food security, climate change, technology, and energy.
Wow, that's really a robust overview of some of the relationships. I'm interested to hear, after 1 year of interactions, how has the relationship between the UAE and Israel evolved? What have you learned about working with Israel? Do you see different opportunities 1 year out now that you know each other a little bit better?
Well, first of all, I think what's important as well, mentioning the UAE and Israel and the world came out of COVID-19 economic recession. The opportunities and the signing of the Abrahamic Accord at that time, and I remember last year here in DC, were a historical moment. And I think it's important to say that. And it's important to say that the opportunities after COVID-19 are endless. We are looking at the huge two dynamic economic areas of the region, the UAE and Israel, and they are both working together to see the opportunities of bilateral trade, increasing relationship. And we're going to say that the Abrahamic Accord is still young, it's still robust, and it's still working together to really push forward these kind of economic agendas forward.
How has the UAE benefited internally? What, if any, impact has the agreement had on the UAE's efforts to diversify its economy?
I remember last year, this question was posed, and the question was posed, asked you, we know what Israel is going to benefit, but we know what the UAE is going to benefit, but what Israel will benefit. And I remember very clearly what I said last year, and I said, Israel maybe posed itself as a startup nation. We pose ourselves as a scale-up nation. And I think a few months ago, His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum tweeted about an Israeli company that actually scaled up in the UAE. And this is literally a hands-on scale-up project that really came into the UAE and scaled up in drones. They took agreements into working with Expo, and they are scaling up their HQ in the UAE, providing technologies such as drones, AI, and so forth. So there's a lot of scale-up opportunities that's coming out of this. And I think this is something where literally today we don't talk, but we actually show examples of what things is happening on the ground.
I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the challenges and obstacles that you've been facing over the last year, some of which I'm sure were expected and some of which have been surprises, I'm guessing. I'm interested specifically about the Israel-UAE oil pipeline deal, which was halted, brought under question due to environmental concerns in Israel. I'm curious where you see this project going, how this hiccup, if you will, is impacting the relationship. Will it change the way that the UAE approaches new deals with Israel?
Well, I can't really specify on the transaction, but let me tell you this about the UAE. UAE today hold a huge track record on climate change, on renewables energy. It holds we're trying to host the COP28 in 2023. We're working together with a lot of works that we do. We do a lot of projects with Masdar and Mubadala globally on areas of environment and climate change. The UAE really can work together in this, especially on the environmental aspects. We bring a lot of knowledge and a lot of expertise, especially as well as Israeli can do that, and we can actually work together to really find ways where we can reduce the environmental issues, not just on this project, but any projects that we work on. UAE really has as well joined to the climate change conference that happened back in April, led by the President Biden. His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid gave a speech on that day. We have a special UAE climate change envoy that really talks about climate change and reducing the aspects on that. So we really have a huge track record of where we're going with this. And I think it's important that we look at the opportunities of this economical transaction as well with the environment at the hand of it.
Staying on challenges for a moment, though, what challenges do you see, including things like regulatory obstacles? How do you see these challenges being overcome?
Well, with regulatory challenges is pretty easy. I think we still have challenges, but I think the UAE today have managed to reduce a lot of regulations, a lot of laws changes that happened last year. The ease of the 100% ownership of companies that we introduced back in May this year. We are as well looking at reducing a lot of regulatory aspects as well on bilateral trade. We're looking into increasing the fund transfers, banks transfers, and financials as well. So we're looking at that in more details, and the news is going to come out very soon.
Great. On that, and you mentioned this really in your opening, which is just the astounding levels of trade between the two countries in such a short period of time, fast partnerships and agreements across sectors. But still short of the $3 billion goal that we had heard officials state at the beginning. And for comparison, the UAE exported $24 billion to Saudi Arabia in 2019, as opposed to about $700 million with Israel. I'm curious what specific steps you're going to be taking to increase trade and get closer to that goal. That's the first piece. And then second, what you're going to do to promote private enterprise that goes beyond the government to government relationship, but really looks at how you're encouraging individual businesses and individuals to engage.
Right. Let me just correct the $3 billion engagement. I think this is something which has to do with the Abrahamic Accord. We do have a $3 billion fund, but it's not a goal for trade. And I think reaching $700 million of trade in less than 1 year is pretty much an achievement by itself. We do really look at much beyond that, and I think in the next couple of years we're going to see more influx of trade in between the two countries. And I think as well, what really needs to be done, I think politicians have done and said a lot. And I think it's time for business to business envoys to start establishing relations, discussions. I really look forward to take a UAE businessman over to Israel to actually converse and engage with Israeli companies, and especially in the areas of healthcare, agri-tech, energy, and so forth. So we're really looking into that. And this is something that we need to do in the next couple of months. I think as well with the Expo 2020 coming in, we are going to see a lot of businessmen coming in from Israel as well, and we're looking at the opportunity where they can converse and as well establish links of trade and businesses together.
Great. Shifting gears a little bit, in the interview that we mentioned with my colleague Amjad last year, he asked you about incorporating economic initiatives for the Palestinians and whether both countries would include the Palestinians in some way in their economic plans. At the time, you said you were working on something that would be announced together soon. Have those efforts proceeded? What prospects do you see for engaging the Palestinians down the road?
The efforts are there and the benefits are compelling. I think the most important part of all of this is to deepen the opportunities further. I think the Abrahamic Accord is still young at this stage. We are 1 year into it, and I think more opportunities of engagement will happen. And I always said last year as well, I said it is whatever good for the economy is good for everyone. Palestinian, Israelis, Emiratis, the region, the youth is what we're looking at. The youth is what needs to prosper from this kind of accord. And I think it's important to look at the youth and how can they actually provide the opportunities together. This accord is really focuses on the economy as well. And I think it's important to increase investment. Whatever the investment that increases will help to create jobs at the end of it. And the jobs is available for everyone to grab.
Great. I just want to remind our listeners that we will move quickly into Q&A. Please submit those questions and whenever possible, your name and affiliation in the Q&A box at the bottom. Your Excellency, beyond signing of the accords, I'm interested to hear the role the U.S. government has been playing on an ongoing basis to support growing relations between you and Israel. How have these agreements affected your relationship with the United States?
Today we are in the United States here with a big delegation, one of the biggest delegations we have economically, joining me with two ministers and a delegation from all the Emirates today, visiting about 6 states, working with the State Departments and Secretary of Commerce to actually look at how do we strengthen the ties with the US and as well with the Israeli as well. So we are really here to discuss, talk, and really find, it's a kind of a fact-finding mission, working on numbers and data. How can we really loosen down barriers of trade and looking at opportunities of investments?
Great. I'm going to move to some questions that I see coming in. I'm going to start with my colleague, Will Wexler, who asks, we've seen significant trade between the United Arab Emirates and Israel, but relations between Israel and some of the other countries in the Abraham Accords have been slower moving. What do those other countries need to do to achieve the types of benefits that the UAE has?
I think what's really needs to happen, not just in the other countries, but as well, any opportunity such as this that arises is important to speed up the bilateral business-to-business engagement. I think my plan is we try to finish the G2G meetings, the government officials, the signing of MOUs, the opening up airlines, visa, traveling. These are the most important part for people to travel, to meet, to discuss. And I always believe that money and ideas moves with humans. And I think the most important part is to allow humans to travel, access airlines, and to get on board and to meet the other counterpart face to face. This will give more opportunities for businesses to happen, and this is something which is very vital and important.
Let's stay on that issue of travel. You're about to host Dubai Expo, where there will be an Israeli pavilion and presumably a lot of Israeli tourists. What are your expectations for Expo? What kind of numbers are you expecting?
The UAE and Dubai more especially are expecting a lot of visitors, and we are used to the infrastructure today in the UAE and Dubai is ready to host millions of visitors coming in every year. And especially for Expo, the project has been postponed for a year, gave us much readiness to host a lot of people in. The hotels, the areas that's available for tourists and the attractions are ready. The weather, let me tell you as well, is getting even better. And this is something which we're looking for as well. 6 months of engagement through Expo will be really, really delightful for people to come in. I invite the world to visit the UAE and Expo, and this is something which is really important for the next couple of months coming.
Not all tourists are their best selves, if you will, when they travel to other countries, and Israelis are no exception. I'm interested how you would react to something like an Israeli tourist misbehaving, if you will, in Dubai at any time while visiting the country, or as stories like that emerge, as they inevitably will, and how that will affect your relations with Israel.
The relations with Israel is really solid. It's very durable. We are working together with the government very actively. Our ambassador in Israel as well is very active as well, working alongside. Today, we're not just hosting the visitors from Israel, but we're hosting the visitors from the world. Everyone comes in from a different background, different cultures, different aspects. And I think today the UAE has been hosting a lot of visitors from everywhere in the world. It's not new for the UAE, and it's always going to be the same. And I think it's important the UAE today has a high standard of hospitality and a high standard of hotels and aspects. And we are really looking forward to see many people coming in.
Excellent. Just shifting gears a little bit, our last panel discussed the desirability of the Biden administration to become greater advocates for the Abraham Accords. While they've welcomed this, they've really taken more of a passive role at this stage. What do you think the US could be doing more constructively to engage on this? What more can they do to support these agreements?
I think conversations, I think the aspects of conversing with the governments, conversing with the region, I think that's the most important foreign policy that needs to happen. That will bring more nations and countries together. COVID-19 really stressed us out, and COVID-19 really stressed the whole economy out. I took the job back in July 2020. It wasn't the easiest job for any Minister of Economy back then. Today, I say, after conversing, meeting people, discussing the economy with the businesses, discussing the economy with the policymakers, with politicians, brought us together into understanding what type of economy we're looking into in the future. I think that's the most important part. And today, after COVID-19, everyone is looking at the future, what type of economy to invest in, what type of regions to go into. And I think this is the right time and opportunity to really converse on the future of economy, what type we're going to work in the future, what happens if another pandemic hits us, are we ready for it? How does the supply chain globally looks like? How do we operate on trade routes? How does that look? So there's a lot of questions that this is the time to look at, not just on the political level, but on countries coming together, looking for peace, looking for economic supercharging the growth in it.
I have more questions coming in from the audience. There's a lot of interest in your visit right now in Washington and the nature of those meetings. I'm curious, at one point there was a discussion of a large US fund being put together from the Development Finance Corporation with you in the in the United States and others to help advance the Abraham Accords. Is this an issue on the agenda for your conversations with US officials? Is this something that you're still pursuing?
We're pursuing a lot of things in this visit. And I think the important part of this visit is one of the biggest economic delegations coming to the US in the time of Biden administration. We're meeting a lot of state officials, and I think it's important to put everything on the table. We're looking here for investments opportunities both ways. The UAE and the US has a long history of trade relations. The UAE trade with the US created about 88,000 jobs. We have billions of dollars of trade in the last couple of years. And I think it's important to look at how can we increase these numbers, increase these data and information that can help us as well prosper after COVID-19.
Another issue that we know is topping the agenda in Washington right now, and really for so many Americans, just after the anniversary of 9/11, is Afghanistan. First of all, I want to thank the UAE for stepping up as a transit point for Afghan refugees. We've seen Bahrain and Qatar doing the same. It's really been such an important service in ensuring that US allies are able to get out of the country. I'm curious what your plans are now. Do you expect that you will allow some of these Afghans to stay in the UAE and work? What are you looking to moving forward?
I can't specify on that kind of details at the moment. We're at the moment looking at wait and see kind of opportunity to see what happens in the next couple of weeks. But the UAE is always known for its peace and neutral positions with the world. And I think it's important to look at. We have about 190 plus nationalities living in the UAE. We have businesses from all over the world happening. We always look at the UAE as a place where business really happens. Scale up at the heart of it. So at this moment, it's a wait and see opportunity, but we're looking at the UAE always hosted the world and always supported the policies globally.
Great. I have another question from our audience about COVID, particularly the impact of Delta. How has COVID impacted some of the ambitions of normalization? What impact do you see it having moving forward? And do you see Delta as a major threat now, particularly when it comes to issues like tourism?
COVID-19 really brought the government and the people together. And I think we learned a lot through the last year and a half or 18 months that have passed through COVID-19. We understood that today health and human health is really important, especially as well the economy at the other side. And we need to really look at how can we balance between the health of people and the health of your economy. With that, we really look at data and numbers. We are the largest country in the world that actually does PCR tests per capita. We are one of the top 10 as well in COVID vaccines. We really keep the masks on and distances, social distancing throughout the whole economy in the UAE. So we're looking at that. We have now one of the lowest numbers happening in the UAE of daily infections, which is about, like yesterday was about 600 something, and it's going down on a downward trend. This is really good numbers to look at as well when you're hosting Expo on the 1st of October. So going back to Expo, and I think it's important to say this, that the COVID-19 and yes, with the Delta happening, the UAE is very close to everyone, very close to the human health, and really keeps an eye on what's happening. We have about 300,000 PCR happens a day. PCR as well today is about $15 a test. And some areas are free for the nationals. And so there is a lot of testing happening in the UAE. And this is what I'm saying. Do not worry. We are testing everyone. We are vaccinating everyone, trying to vaccinate everyone. And this is something where we are moving on.
Great. Another question from the audience. Countries like Sudan have not seen material benefits of the Abraham Accords. In fact, I mean, really, the Sudanese have signed on to the Abraham Accords, but haven't actually signed a bilateral agreement yet with the Israelis, something that is very much in process. The UAE has been significantly involved in Sudan and its transitions. Do you see them officially normalizing relations with Israel soon? What more can the UAE and others do to help Sudan benefit from joining the normalizing community?
And I think Sudan and all the countries need to look at the economy and the region. And the economy today after COVID-19 is that's a priority. And I think looking at the countries, we need to really focus on our economy, creating jobs at the end of the day for both nations. And I really look at that, not just with the Sudan and Israel, but with the world as well. Coming from an area where we look at data and information, we understand that the situation today is much, much better 18 months or 12 months ago. And I go back and urge for the engagement that needs to happen to actually accelerate anything to do with economical growth, finding jobs, creating jobs is something which is a very vital opportunity for any country to come together and talk about it, especially for the Sudanese youth and the job prosperity that comes in.
Great. Your Excellency, I'd like to give you an opportunity for closing remarks instead of just my, rapid fire questions of you. I want to thank you, first of all, for all of the work that you are personally doing, but also that the UAE has been doing, really in leading the way for normalization and a broader regional peace between Israel and its neighbors. Is there any kind of key message that our audience should take away as they look to the year ahead, reflect on the year behind, what opportunities exist, and what to expect from the UAE?
The last remarks, I think, is more about peace and prosperity, and I think it's important to look at that. There's no doubt the UAE and Israel has a lot of opportunities economically, but the peace that comes with the accord is something which is very important. The region has been through a lot of political engagement, and I think we need to look at after COVID-19 in an area of the world where should peace come into it. So this is something which we need to really put it at the heart of this. We need to leave a lot of things behind us and really look at the focus on the future of jobs and youth and creating some light through the tunnel. And this is something which is very vital and important. The next stage is very, very vital for us and for the region. We need to really look at cooperation. We need to look at engagement, allowing the trade flows to happen, and allowing the businesses to establish. And this is something we'll really integrate the whole world together.
Excellent. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time. I hope you have a successful visit in Washington and look forward to continuing this discussion, perhaps even in a year from now.
Most welcome. Really, it's a pleasure of mine. Thank you very much.
Take care. Thank you. And with that, we conclude our program. I want to thank all of our guests for joining us today. I specifically would like to thank my colleagues Yulia Shalomov, Will Wexler, and Kirsten Fontenrose for all their help in making this event possible, and to thank our panelists for laying out such rich detail on the opportunities and challenges ahead for normalization, and to thank you all so much for joining us today. I do urge you to stay tuned. In the coming weeks and months, we will be holding a number of events that touch on normalization, the issues at stake, and the opportunities. And with that, we hope to see you in the future and in coming events. Our team will be sending you more information about these opportunities soon. Thank you all. Have a great day.